See if you could find a person to have Valentine's Day with in the next few months. So I call it Shyness, Charlie Brown, and Valentine's Day. The questions I'll be trying to focus on is I'll try to distinguish between shyness and introversion, and between shyness and social anxiety. I'll talk about some amazing developmental research about how shyness changes across development and how many of us are able to shed our shy behaviors. And if you look at us when we're 15, 25, 35, we may no longer look shy. The fascinating thing is that if you look more deeply at our psychophysiology or at our brain functioning, what you'll find is that we actually still have the underlying architecture of shyness, but somehow we've learned to manage how we behave, so that even though our physiology and our brain circuits are sending signals to be fearful, we can still push through that. Final thing I'll try to do is, after I've described what shyness is, what social anxiety is, I'll talk about some ideas for how we can overcome shyness. Now, I know that many of you aren't shy. Many of you may be raging extroverts. But everyone, I'm sure, knows some shy people and has some shy friends or shy siblings. And many of us are shy. So I think it will be a relevant lecture. I skipped over this, but there's another HEB lecture on Friday at 3:30, and there's not a climate march that's competing with it this week. And one of the things they're trying to do with the HEB lectures is they're trying to bring in outstanding women psychology researchers. So 3/4 of the HEB lectures over the last couple of years have been outstanding women researchers. And this is a woman researcher. She's being brought in by the social psychology group. And she's going to talk about women and STEM and how to protect outstanding women students from losing interest or being driven away from the science fields. So it looks interesting. I really don't know anything about it, but I will be here. And afterward, there's a wine and cheese. It's in the building next to this, the Bellini building. It's down at the ground floor of this building. They have a nice spread. There were very few people last week. I was able to have my whole dinner down there. So now, as an example of shyness, I'm going to use a clip about Charlie Brown, who, if you ever read the cartoon or watched the movies, you know he kind of has a thing for a little red-haired girl. And unfortunately, though, he lacks the courage to ever even talk to her.
What an awful day this has been. Tomorrow is the last day of school, and I still haven't met that little red-haired girl. If I don't meet her tomorrow, I won't see her all summer. I came so close, too. Several times I almost met her. I almost talked to her. Tomorrow I've got to do it. Tomorrow is D-Day. Instead of walking to school tomorrow, I'll get up real early and meet her at the school bus. I'll be the first one there, so I won't miss her. Don't you think that's a good idea, Snoopy? Snoopy? Snoopy?
Okay, so poor Charlie fails again, but he did a couple things right. One of the things that evolutionary psychologists say is the key is figuring out the habitats where desirable others are, and then putting yourself in those habitats. And he also has kind of a plan, and it's not a terrible plan. He doesn't enact it well. But I've used Charlie Brown before as an example because cartoons, you can quickly pick up consistencies in social, emotional behavior. I suggested that Charlie Brown is high on neuroticism, but that the extroversion is a little tricky because he is a pretty sociable, gregarious guy who seeks out other people. So on the social vitality side of extroversion, I would say he's, even maybe above the midpoint. It's on the assertiveness, social confidence side that poor Charlie is lacking. Okay. Now, I decided to teach this particular lecture because 5-6 years ago I was using the book Quiet by Susan Cain, which is called The Power of Quiet, and it focuses on introversion and shyness, and it makes the case that introversion can be highly adaptive. She even looks at other animal species and she identifies examples where being more shy and risk averse actually increase your chances of survival. And she also, in her book, identified a number of things about introversion that seem adaptive. So her basic point, I think, is that introversion is a different style. We should be accepting of it, and we can have a fine life, albeit a quieter life, if we're introverted. Because of Susan Cain, she had a wide impact with her book and her TED Talk and her interviews, and all of the major magazines were doing stories about the power of quiet, the power of introversion, or the power of shyness. And I was a little concerned because I felt they were confusing introversion and shyness, and they were also confusing shyness and social anxiety. These things can be related. I'll tell you that I think the easiest way to think of it is that it's like a subset within a subset within a subset. I'll show you how psychologists measure these different things. I'd rather get going for a while before I stop. The first scale that I'll show you is an introversion scale. It's one that Susan Cain used. I don't think it's the one by the big 5 researchers, so I'm not sure it's the best one. But there's 20 items here, like do you often long for excitement? Are you usually carefree? Those are extroverted items. That's one of the great things about being an extrovert. You're carefree. But then there's a number of things that I indicate with a green arrow, which are actually items that score for introversion. Do you stop things to think things over before doing anything? Do you prefer reading to meeting people? Do you prefer to have a few but special friends? Are you mostly quiet when you're with people? Now, some of those I think are classic introverted items, which suggest you enjoy spending time alone, away from people, more than others might. And this item about do you prefer reading than getting together with friends? When I was an 18-year-old on a Friday, I would prefer watching an old movie or reading a book rather than going to where other 18-year-olds were. Was it a preference or was it something else? I'm not sure. But those are introverted items. But some of these introverted items aren't even social. They're more about your way of moving and acting in the world. And they have to do with how much stimulation you want. So I like to do the kind of work where I can pay close attention. That codes for introversion. Are you slow and unhurried in the way you move? If you've ever seen me walking about, I'm slow and unhurried. Do you find it hard to enjoy yourself at a lively party? I would just note that there's a mix, and there's some items that have nothing social about them, but they're just about a more quiet, slow-moving temperament, maybe more deliberative, contemplative. And so introversion, Susan Cain would suggest about 1/3 of us are probably more on the introverted end. Now, I'll show you shyness, and I'll describe the items, and it turns out about 1/3 of introverts probably are actually shy. There's an online test you could take. I just took it earlier. It's only like 12 items. It's really neat. And there's all kinds of resources put together by the American Psychology Association if you are shy. So the second one measures shyness. Actually, this is the scale, yeah. You rate it on 1 to 5, whether you disagree or agree and how much. I feel tense when I'm with people I don't know well. I'm somewhat socially awkward. I find it difficult to ask other people for information. I'm often uncomfortable at parties. I feel nervous when speaking to someone in authority. I have doubts about my social competence. I feel inhibited in social situations. All of these items are social, and they don't have to do with a general preference to be on your own versus to be with people. They're more specific, and they're about how much anxiety and inhibition you experience around various social situations. Those of us who are shy, what we often experience is kind of a foreboding about evaluation. Not necessarily in all our interactions, not with our little sister or our parents or our cousins, but it's something we'd feel on the first day of school with new students. It's something we're more likely to feel when there's someone who we think might outrank us or who we might be interested in some way. Then we're more concerned about saying the wrong thing, making a bad impression. So on this particular test, you could get a score between 13 and 65. My score this morning was a 42, and I was told that I'm somewhat shy. Most shy people score over 39, and a few reach the possible high score of 65. So that's extremely shy. I'm not sure where shyness becomes a problem. I'll talk about that. You could take that test online. You may have already taken it while I was talking. And there's also some wonderful resources to learn more about shyness. So, introversion, I think Susan Cain makes a great argument that it's just a different style. We're wired to need less stimulation to be more comfortable on our own. Shyness is a gray area. I'll talk more about that. Generally, experiencing anxiety, feeling inhibited, that's not good. That's going to interfere with feeling like we've had a good day and we've interacted and pursued the things we wanted to do. Now the next step, so I've said 30% are introverted, 30% of the introverts are shy, so now we're down to, let's say, 11, 12%. And it turns out about 3 or 4% of us have social anxiety disorder. And I'll show you some of the items that can be used to, roughly assess this. This is something that would be assessed with a psychologist or a psychiatrist, and it has more to do with how your anxiety and inhibition are interfering with your life. Some of these items really surprised me the first time I saw it. I often think of myself as someone who might have been borderline socially anxious, but a socially anxious person has a hard time telephoning in public when others are around. A socially anxious person has trouble eating in public places. Calling someone you don't know very well, that I have trouble with. Giving a talk in front of an audience, socially anxious people are nervous about that. Now that's a funny one because all of us are. I once heard a statistic that more than half of us, if we have to give a public talk, we would prefer to be hit by a car so that we don't have to give the talk. More than half of us. So fear of public speaking, that doesn't really indicate. It's just that my guess is a socially anxious person, if they have to give a class presentation with 15 students, it could be paralyzing how much they'll be afraid. Speaking up at a meeting. And so there's 15 items and some baseline statistics. In the United States, 80% of adults get married. That's true for introverted people. That's true for extroverted people. Among shy people, 80% of us still get married. Socially anxious is below 40% of us. So the social anxiety disorder is so impactful on our way of living our lives that it cuts our chances of finding a marital partner in half. And I think, so as we move from introversion to shyness to social anxiety disorder, I think it becomes less adaptive and more problematic. So here's something that one of the articles said. 30% of all people fall on the introvert end, but it takes some explaining to understand just what the label means. Introverted does not have to mean shy, though there is overlap. Shyness is a form of anxiety characterized by inhibited behavior. It also implies a fear of social judgment. Shy people actively seek to avoid social situations, even ones they might want to take part in. Yeah, that's a key thing, is that shy people wish often that they could be going to parties and introducing themselves to people. Okay. I'm going to